So there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from New York is Babatunde Omilola. He is a team leader with the United Nations Development Programme. We also have South African radio news anchor Nhlanhla Sehume, who is with us from Johannesburg. And joining us here in the studio is Executive Director of the African Immigrant Caucus, and that is Nii Akuetteh. Thank you so much, all of us, to join us. Let's go to Joburg and Nhlanhla first. Obviously, African Union summits always very important, but this seeming like a turning point almost for the African Union in terms of reform of itself, but also gaining more momentum on the African continent.
Yes, the proposal for reforms is being spearheaded by the new chair of the African Union in Rwanda's President Paul Kagame. But it's being met with a bit of resistance from countries the likes of South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria, which are big donors to the African Union, accounting for just over 45% or so. We do understand or know that much of the money or the funding for the African Union comes from international donors. But now Kagame's proposal now is that the AU should be able to sustain itself, or rather that maybe levies should be paid, 0.2% levies, which would account for some 1.2 billion rand in cash for the AU. So he wants the AU to be more self-reliant.
Babatunde, are you seeing a change in terms of how the African Union wants to be? I mean, we have, for example, focuses on a lot of reforms that would make the African Union much more dominant in African Union politics, calls for upgrading the Secretariat, modelling perhaps on the United Nations itself, the European Union, other regional blocs. Are you seeing this as a way forward, or do you think it will be difficult to implement given the vast differences on the African continent? I mean, it is over 50 countries.
I think this is a very good way forward for Africa in many ways, because for the very first time, we are talking about institutional reform of the African Union Commission itself. And we are putting also on the agenda issue in terms of combating and preventing corruption on the continent. I think for me, this is really welcome. It's really very good. It's welcome for two reasons. The first reason is because for a very long period of time, African leaders come up with all kinds of resolutions, all kinds of ratifications. But then, when it comes to implementation, many of these ratifications or resolutions are never really implemented in different individual African countries. So implementation for us is really very essential, and that's why this whole idea of reform is critical. It's also very critical because they are putting in place some mechanisms whereby you can enforce sanctions on countries that do not abide with legally binding agreements that have been agreed upon by many African countries. I think modeling this alongside what we currently have at the United Nations is good for the continent. It's also good for the continent because we will be able to talk about how to mobilize resources domestically and then use our own resources to fund our own development and then deal with all kinds of reforms that should happen on the continent, you know. And I think for me, this is also essential in terms of generating good social and human development outcomes for the continent. It's also good for peace and security. It's good for issues around how we deal with corruption that all of us have heard a lot about. We now know that around $148 billion is lost every year in Africa due to corruption. So if we are able to reform the organization itself, we will be able to go a long way to eradicating poverty and hunger. Now on the continent, we have around 283 million Africans that go to bed hungry every night, out of 815 million hungry people around the world. So if we have genuine reforms, you know, within this particular body of Africa, then we'll be able to talk about development on the continent.
Excellent rundown there, Babatunde. I just want to go back to Joburg and Nhlanhla. Corruption, one of the major themes. You're sitting in Johannesburg, where in South Africa, a lot of debate about potential corruption internally. Is this a big thing in terms of the future of the continent? South Africa, of course, one of the biggest economies. Babatunde put the figure, and the UN puts the figure at $148 billion a year lost in corruption. That's a big deal for the continent, right?
Definitely is, especially for South Africa. The issue of corruption resonates with a lot of South Africans. With the new leader of the ANC in Cyril Ramaphosa being elected in December last year, he's one person whose a lot of responsibility now lies on his shoulder to be the man who champions the call for eradicating corruption in the country. There has been the State of Capture Commission of Inquiry that has been set up, somewhat showing a commitment from the government to tackle the issue of state capture and corruption. Yes, the terms of reference of the State Capture Commission were set just as recently as last week. So everybody will be looking at such mechanisms which are meant to deal with corruption in the country. Corruption takes away a lot from the economy as well. International ratings agencies such as Moody's will be looking at South Africa very closely to see how it deals with issues of corruption.
Nii, here in the studio, what for you were the standouts of the African Union meetings in Addis? Because obviously we had this corruption debate, we've got this development debate, but also big security issues on the continent. I'm thinking of South Sudan, but of course you could talk about Somalia, you could talk about Boko Haram, you could talk about Al-Shabaab, we could talk about lots of potential problems also in East Africa. What is the priorities for the African Union going forward?
What I'm looking at, what I'm going to be diving into, in addition to the issue of corruption, which clearly is an important issue, and the African Union itself made it its theme, so they think it's #1. But there are other pressing problems. In fact, the litany of security problems that you listed are all true. I will add the Maghreb, North Africa. I'll add the Sahel, where if you take just Mali, in 1 week, they've been hit 3 times, Thursday, Saturday, and yesterday, Sunday. So the issue of security, terrorism, and civil war, Central African Republic, South Sudan, are all important. But, you know, in talking about how the African Union is to be reformed, our brother in Johannesburg, I think, made a key point. There are many issues where Nigeria and South Africa don't see eye to eye. They are sort of rivals. And
that's putting it mildly, yes.
Yes. And so if they and the other giant on the continent, Egypt, if all 3 big guys are opposed to the plan that is being put forward, that worries me, because Omilola is totally correct that these are good reforms on paper, but will they get carried out? They cannot be carried out if the 3 most important members of the African Union are opposed to it. So you have to find a way to then persuade them. And of course, the other issue for me, since I live in Washington, my mind has been dominated by what the president in the United States, the way he disparaged Africa.
Okay, I'm going to leave you there because I wanted to save that for later, but while you brought it up, let's actually listen to the African Union Commission chair on this very subject, because obviously it did rankle a lot of leaders.
At the time of this session, Africa has yet to digest the statement issued by the President of the United States, who has profoundly shocked with a message conveying contempt, hate and desire to marginalize and exclude Africans. These remarks followed others on Jerusalem and the reduction of contributions to the budget for global peacekeeping, leading one to think that multilateralism is in the midst of a grave crisis. The continent will not be silent on this subject.
Nii Akuetteh, you want to follow up on that?
Yes, you know, of course it caused a firestorm all over, including here in Washington, but also on the continent. And I have to tell you, actually, I am glad that the African leaders and countries are not letting it pass. This is my own personal obsession, that African leaders are often too supine because they need money from the international community. They accept a lot of things they shouldn't accept. And I think the comments by the President of the United States, now, of course, he has said he did not use those exact words, but he also said he used tough language. But the sentiment is the same. Africans are not welcome as immigrants, but Norwegians are. I think it is terrible. So
you think it's racist?
Yes, I do. And I think it is important that the Africans are not letting it go. They are pushing back on it. Mr. Trump has written a letter. He's dispatching Mr. Tillerson to go to 5 or 6 countries on the continent. I mean, trying to make amends for it. But the letter, in the letter, he couldn't bring himself to say, I'm sorry, you know. And so this is something to watch. But I'm glad that the Africans are not letting it pass, because in their dealings with the European Union, in their dealings with the United States, in their dealings with any of the big powers, I think it's like, well, we need a little money so you can say or do anything to us, and that's okay. I am glad, and I hope that this is finally a time when they are drawing the line, that we want respect, we want equal treatment, and we don't want to be disparaged anymore.
Babatunde, why aren't the UN condemning what the President of the US said about African countries?
I mean, I think all the key African leaders have responded appropriately to the alleged comments by the President of the United States of America. But I think the reality is that a lot of African countries have actually done a lot in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of hunger reduction, and also in terms of how to look after the welfare of African people. But that is not enough, and we have to come back to the basis in the sense of what are the challenges remaining on the continent that we need to face. One of the key challenges is about poverty eradication. We have Africa as the only continent that has actually increased the absolute number of poor people by 113 million between 1990 and 2013. So we need to face all of these challenges. We have a continent that has not really grown properly the way it should grow. The growth rate for this year is projected to be around 4.1%. And for us at the United Nations, the way we look at all of those comments will be how do we look inward into supporting African countries, into building stronger African economies, into achieving inclusive economic growth on the African continent, but also into achieving peace and security, and looking at ways whereby we can invest in African people and also invest in infrastructure on the continent.
And Nhlanhla, you're in South Africa, no stranger to racially divisive language, actions and policies. Hearing from US President Donald Trump in that way, what's the South African reaction, and how can it be turned into a positive if people are trying to full focus on the African continent for the US?
Well, in South Africa, there's been widespread condemnation of the US president's alleged remarks. Many were looking to the African Union to denounce these remarks as a collective, to send out a strong message condemning these actions. It was quite heartwarming to hear comments made by the AU Commission Chair Moussa Faki condemning President Trump's remarks. So there's been a very positive response or reaction, because at least there's been some kind of signal or some kind of comment that's been made by the African Union, clearly not keeping quiet about these remarks by the US president. But with a country like South Africa that is still split between the middle when it comes to issues of race, it was one of those moments where this widespread condemnation was one where, even as a collective, South Africans were very audible and very loud in saying that we do not appreciate the comments that are being made by the US president, even though, yes, the US is a big donor to a country like South Africa, or trades a lot with South Africa, but still we need to be respected, not just by the US, but more especially by their leader as well.
Especially because, I want to move on for this, especially because, you know, Africa is a big success story in recent years. Joining us from Nairobi is Aly-Khan Satchu. He's CEO of Rich Management, an East African investment firm. I don't need to tell you some of the opportunities that have been available in the recent years and decades in Africa. We're looking at a continent-wide growth rate of 3.5 to 3.7%. Europe would kill for that, wouldn't they? You know, there are great things going on in Africa. Do you want to detail whether how well the African economic success story is going, but also the problems, because there's a lot of growing population too?
Absolutely. You know, Africa had a sweet spot for about a decade. It coincided with the increase in Chinese trade with Africa. But really, in the last 3 years, as you've properly mentioned, we've been in the bit of a slow lane. Population growth has outstripped GDP growth. That's why you've had this refrain, which was taken up by the African Development Bank, that you can't eat GDP. So I think what we've got here is we haven't had sufficient trickle down. We've had good growth. We've had a strong expansion. But I think if some people have gotten left behind, and really in the last 24 months, it's been pretty tricky. There is tremendous opportunity on this continent. We've got the young people, this demographic bulge, which can turn into, that dividend could be a time bomb. But if it's played properly, it's going to be part of the success of Africa in the next 10, 15 years. The continent, natural resources, but more importantly, it's all about the people that are walking upon the ground, not what can be dug out of it. Still, overlaying all of that, we have tremendous complications. You have to look at places like DR Congo, which should be a Brazil. Sure. But we've got, we've got the problems that we got there now. So plenty of challenges, but the investment case is very clear.
I want to go on to security challenges in a second, but you brought up a very good point about young people in Africa, a huge growing demographic. And I want to bring in Babatunde again, because there is a plan at the African Union to actually really push for education and training in terms of the young people in Africa, stop the brain drain that we've seen, but also create capacity for things like engineering, computer jobs, all the things that will add value to the African continent going forward. It's an ambitious plan going into the 2060s. Is that possible?
I think it's very possible. We have in Africa 420 million young people between ages 15 and 35 out of 1.2 billion people on the continent. I think it's really possible if we invest in African young people in terms of education, in terms of their health, in terms of their economic prosperity. We also need to unleash their entrepreneurship skills, and I think this is really vital and fundamental for making sure that we achieve inclusive growth on the continent and we reduce poverty. So for me, I think the way we look at how to look at our young people on the continent of Africa will be how they engage not only in economic matters, but also in political issues, in social life, and also become part of the African, agenda. I see a lot of African leaders today, many of them, they are over 70 years old. 20 out of the 54 African leaders that we have, they are at least above 70 years old. So the key question is, you see many of them that are still parading themselves in this, since the 1960s, when a lot of African economies got independence. You need to see more young people getting into the political space, into the economic space, into the social space on the continent, and then lifting up the continent the way it should be, and what we have seen in other parts of the world. In Austria, for instance, the Chancellor of Austria, the new one, is a 31-year-old gentleman called Sebastian Kurz. We have in New Zealand, a 37-year-old lady becoming the Prime Minister. We've also seen in France, Emmanuel Macron, who will be 40 years old this year. So in Africa, we need to be able to invest in young African people so that they can become part and parcel of the fabric of African society.
I'm glad you brought up new leaders. Actually, Nii, here in the studio, we did have a few new leaders at the African Union, and very sort of important ones. So Zimbabwe was without Robert Mugabe. We also had a rather popular footballer in terms of Liberia's new leader, and Angola too. Yes. Are we seeing a changeover, a change of the guard a little bit, or is it just too much to say, given those 3 countries and over 50 African countries represented?
This is an issue that is very important to me. But the way I look at it is, it's an issue of democracy. It's not an issue of age, okay? I mean, you look at the U.S., we talk about Mr. Trump, he's 71 years old. You can give him bad marks on any number of things, but he was elected in a democratic system. The vision for any African country is not lodged in people by age. Yes, we have a huge youth bulge, and it needs to be incorporated. But I think we really, really, really must push democracy. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Zimbabwe, because I think over the last 10 years, the one thing that the African Union has done, which I think is the best thing they've done, and it's wonderful, when they set their foot down and said, no to unconstitutional government changes. I think what happened in Zimbabwe was a coup, but there was so much animosity towards Robert Mugabe for reasons that we can't go into now. And
separate show, yeah.
Yes, and therefore it was like, okay, we'll get rid of him by any means necessary. I think it is terrible. I think that the African Union admitting Mr. Mnangagwa, given that he came to power through a coup, sets a very bad example. So I agree that, yes, we have many challenges, and the youth bulge and youthful people in politics is important. But I'm saying it should not be a matter of demographic group by saying this group belongs, this group doesn't belong. It has to be democracy, open democracy. Yes.
Okay. Aly-Khan, I want to go back to you because you touched briefly on the security situation, which of course affects investment in Africa. You mentioned the DRC should be Brazil, but it's limping towards these elections, which have been postponed time and time again. Civil strife between Joseph Kabila's power base and others. We are also seeing increased tensions in East Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia. There is spillover from the competition between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other Gulf nations. How is this affecting East Africa and the rest of East Africa in terms of not just the investment environment, but stability in general?
Well, you know, here in Kenya in particular, we've been fighting. Here in Kenya in particular, we've been dealing with the Al-Shabaab menace for a number of years. But what we've seen is a significant step change, as you've described. First of all, that wide swathe of the Sahel, this global warming phenomenon which has created a petri dish for terrorism from east to west. So that lack of security has not been helpful. The US has taken a very, very militarized response under President Trump to this problem. You've seen that in a huge step up in interventions in Somalia. So I think, you know, the insecurity issue remains very, very front and center. 16 of the most affected countries by climate change are in Africa. So we've got a kind of perfect storm on the security situation. We're hoping that it does not spill over here into East Africa. But you saw comments from Gutierrez about South Sudan, about the leadership there. You've seen what's happening in Somalia. We're very conscious we're living in a dangerous neighborhood. And I don't see a silver bullet yet that's going to bring that change. If I could just briefly respond to what was the other guests were discussing, which was this wide gap between the age of our leaders and our citizens and the change we're seeing. Africa's, it's not one country. The change is happening. It's non-linear. At times it accelerates, at times it slows down. But what is very noticeable for me in the last week or so is the change that's happening in the southern belt. Ramaphosa at Davos, what an awesome intervention. Turn the page. Everyone's got bulled up about what he's going to do. Similar to Mnangagwa, whatever you think about the coup, whether it wasn't a coup, it was time for a change. Mugabe had to go. If that was the way he had to go, so be it. He's gone. And again, Laurencio, trying to turn around a non-functioning rentier economy. I think there's reasons for optimism in the change we've seen in the Southern Belt. I think if you look at the continent, you've got to say we're going in the right direction. But at times it does feel like it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back.
You know, on that optimistic note, I think we'll end it. That's all we have time for. It's good to have optimism from the African Union, especially after perhaps the US President's comments and the reaction to that. From Johannesburg, from Nairobi, from New York, and from here in the studio, that's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation, of course, does continue online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.